Hey, it's Marcel. I am excited about this new offer to my podcast listeners. You can now receive all my best coaching tips, advice, and strategies, daily micro challenges, exclusive stuff straight from my coaching toolbox. All of that can now come to your phone via text for the price of a cheap cup of coffee, $4.95 per month. That's it. And you get a 14-day trial to take it for a spin, and if you don't like it, no biggie, you just type stop and you won't hear from me again. It's that simple. And by the way, you're going to be texting me, not a robot. It's not AI driven. It's me on the other end sending you weekly messages to help you become a better and more effective leader. I would love to engage you by text, so if you want to subscribe, grab a pen and a piece of paper right now. I'm going to give you a number. Text me the word love, LOVE, to 424-377-7916. Again, text me the word love to 424-377-7916.
Welcome to the Love in Action Podcast, the show that explores all the ways you can evolve into the best version of yourself as a leader. I'm your host, executive coach, speaker, and author, Marcel Schwantes. I believe that when we show up with our full humanity to work and lead from a place of love and care and inclusion, it will make a radical difference in your leadership, your business, and your bottom line. This is a show about love as a leadership and business strategy. Let's do this.
All right, so I've got a great show for you. We're going to get into some neuroscience today and talk to world-renowned Stanford neurosurgeon, Dr. James Doty. And, there's a concept out there called manifestation. You may have heard of the law of attraction, kind of a similar idea. And the practice of manifestation, which it's been around for decades now, is that a lot of us, we were stuck in our lives. We kind of are having a hard time realizing our goals and dreams, right? Where we want to be. And so a lot of the process of manifestation has to do with having the power to physically alter our brains. And through that process of manifestation, we have the power to pursue the life that we want. Now, it sounds very new agey, right? And a lot of people dismiss manifestation as pseudoscience. But Dr. Doty is going to explain how manifestation is actually rooted in real, solid, evidence-based science, in that process physically alters our brain to help us to create the reality that we want, whether it's becoming more productive at work, start a new business, reach our goals and dreams, maybe get over a horrible addiction or a cycle of poverty. So he's going to lay out the groundwork for us to not only achieve a better life through manifestation and the brain science behind it, but how this process can lead to a better world. I don't have to tell you the kind of world that we live in now. So Dr. Doty wrote a book, was just released in May. It's called Mind Magic, the Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. It's manifestation that lifted Dr. Doty from a horrific, impoverished childhood to a successful career now as a neurosurgeon and a successful entrepreneur. But it's funny that he also acknowledges that, and he tells the story in a minute here, that he went from rags to riches, and then when he reached the top, he went from riches to rags in a metaphysical sense, meaning that he wasn't living the life that he truly wanted. He wasn't fulfilled because he realized that he was pursuing the material, he was pursuing wealth, and neglecting the spiritual. Now, we're going to define what he means by spiritual in this sense. So I've given you enough of a sneak peek. And by the way, I was skeptical, until I got the book and I read through it and I understood that this is all backed by brain science. And so we're going to learn about how to connect brain science to real world elements that we can all achieve to pursue our goals. All right, as I mentioned, Dr. James Doty is a renowned neurosurgeon, serial entrepreneur, New York Times best-selling author. Let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Dr. James Doty. All right, so Dr. James Doty now joins us. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a joy to be with you, and thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I've been following you for a while now. It is a privilege and an honor that you're here. So we start this way. You ready?
Well, I don't know how many people can be completely ready interacting with you, but I'm as ready as I'm going to be.
And I'm curious where this question or the answer to this question is going. Okay, so what's your story?
Well, I could say all of us have interesting stories, which I think is true if you delve into people's lives. But in terms of my story, and sort of probably why we're here today, I grew up in poverty. My father was an alcoholic, and my mother had had a stroke when I was a child and was partially paralyzed and had a seizure disorder. And we were on public assistance essentially my entire childhood. And in fact, had been evicted from various residences. And as you can imagine, children growing up in those types of environments, sort of becoming a quote unquote success in life is very challenging. And I'm sure you're aware of adverse childhood experiences. And when you have a combination of drug or alcohol abuse or mental illness or poverty, that has a huge impact whether you were able to quote unquote succeed in society. And what happened to me and formed the basis of my first book, Into the Magic Shop, was that when there was conflict in my house, which was not that unusual, I would get on my bicycle and typically ride as fast and as far away as I could from my house. And on one of those excursions, I ended up at a strip mall. And I'd had always an interest in magic. And in this instance, there was a magic shop there. So I went inside, and I was greeted actually by a woman who I would describe her as having a radiant presence. And it turned out she was the owner's mother, and she actually knew nothing about magic. And she was one of these people who just emanated kindness. And, you know, for a kid like me, and I was 12 at the time, who was sort of filled with fear, hopelessness, despair, she greeted me in a very kind fashion and treated me actually like an equal in our interaction. And of course, what that resulted in is creating an environment of quote unquote psychological safety, and where I felt comfortable interacting with her. And so she asked a few penetrating questions, which I would never normally answer. But after we were talking for about 15 or 20 minutes, she said to me, you know, I really like you. I'm here for another 6 weeks. If you show up every day, I think I could teach you something that could help you. Now, I was not in any way self-aware, but I said yes. And the reason I said yes was because I had absolutely nothing else to do. And she was giving me chocolate chip cookies. So those were the two drivers of my behavior, which chocolate chip cookies, that hasn't changed much. But anyway, what happened over that 6-week period was really quite extraordinary in terms of my own life or the impact it had. And this was before mindfulness or meditation were discussed in sort of the public lexicon, and nor were terms like neuroplasticity used at all. That was unknown. It was thought that the brain was static and was immutable. Long story short is she taught me what is now known as a mindfulness practice. And I did not realize it, but what happens oftentimes in children in these types of environments, it's as if they're in a chronic war zone. So they're traumatized, their sympathetic nervous system, this flight, fight, fear response is chronically activated. Their muscles are always tense because they're planning on, you know, potentially having to move quickly. And it's very hard to focus because you're always looking around wondering what's going to happen. And so she taught me a method of what we now call a body survey, but it was fundamentally relaxing the body from the toes to the top of your head. And this was followed by a attention or focus practice or being present. And this was based on actually looking at a candle. And once I had, and I won't say use the word master, but once I was comfortable with that, she made me realize that the dialogue that was going on in my head was not truth. And because would tell myself, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, I don't deserve to be loved, and that's why I'm in this position. And I think these are narratives, sadly, that a lot of children have who grow up in challenging environments. But she taught me a way to diminish that negative self-talk and actually also replace it with positive affirmations. And as you probably know, if you're hypercritical with yourself, which so many people are, you end up having a skewed view of the rest of the world because you're hypercritical of others. And what happened is through this time with her, it made me look at the world a different way. I no longer had anger towards my parents or the situation. And what I say is once I changed how I looked at the world changed how it looked at me. And from this, she taught me a visualization practice or manifestation practice and the fundamental techniques of that. The problem with that was, though, that as a 12-year-old who grew up in poverty, I was focused on what I thought success meant or accomplishment. And so she asked me to make a list of 10 things I wanted. And I wanted to be a doctor, but I also wanted to be a doctor so people would look at me and say I was okay. I wanted a mansion. I wanted $1 million, which probably when I was 12, which was over 50 years ago, that was a lot of money. But I wanted a Rolex watch. A friend of mine's father had one. He told me how much it cost, and I admired that. And I saw a Porsche drive by, a silver Porsche Targa, and I said, I have to have that. So I made this long list. And the interesting thing is I did get all of those things, but it did not make me happy. And from that book, which was very popular, a lot of people asked me about manifestation. And as a neuroscientist, I looked into that quite deeply. And I wrote this new book, Mind Magic, which was an attempt to separate the woo-woo and the pseudoscience so that people understand that this is all about activating cognitive brain networks and embedding your intention into your subconscious. But it also has to do with being in the right mental state to do so if you wish to increase the likelihood of you manifesting something. So in that long-winded explanation, I hope I answered your question.
You did, and there's so many little rabbit holes that I want to go down. But can I go back to Ruth before we dive into mind magic? Because there's interesting here is Ruth's not a scientist. She's just the mother of a guy that owned a magic shop. How the heck did she know all this stuff before, and she's passing it on to you, a 12-year-old going through trauma. To me, that's a manifestation in itself, maybe on Ruth's end, to change the life of somebody like you who went on to become renowned and in your field. But where did she get all that from to pass on to you?
Well, again, it's interesting because, frankly, I don't know. If you want to say, you remember the term that was often used long ago, an earth mother? She was that earth mother type. She was wearing this flowing muumuu, and she had this long wavy hair, and she sort of was very free. And I have to assume she probably spent time either in Haight-Ashbury or in the East somewhere. But I actually don't know for sure. As a 12-year-old, I wasn't insightful enough to query her on why she was teaching me this or even doing it. Although one of the interesting aspects of this is that she had a grandson, and the parents had divorced. So the grandson was supposed to visit her the father for 6 weeks during the summer. And apparently the parents got into an argument, and the mother refused to send the boy that summer. So in some ways, I was probably the substitute for her grandson, which I'm thankful for.
Yeah. So a little sidebar, my wife is, she was trained, she's a Vanderbilt trained mental health therapist, counselor, right? And so the first 10, 15 years, she's went on to now become a coach rather than a therapist, solutions focused, type of coach, still applying the same training that she had at Vanderbilt, but more forward movement than looking back. And the first 10, 15 years, all she saw were kids that were raised in traumatic, horrific environments, where, they were sexually abused, neglected, et cetera, you name it. And they never had the tools to, when you're a kid, you don't know anything about mindfulness. And so these kids then eventually went on to become adults who suffer from eating disorders, bulimia, anorexia, and alcoholism, drug addiction. So is there hope for people like that, would you say, at that stage of life when they didn't get the tools early on, and maybe now they're going through life in their 30s, trying to find their way and still steeped in addiction? And how does manifestation play a role in taking you out of that kind of life?
Well, there's always hope, and we see it every day in different situations. But it's difficult because I'm sure you appreciate that during key development periods or bonding or attachment periods in your life, which occur when you're younger, if that is messed up through abuse, neglect, etc., then you start confusing what love is versus negative events that have happened to you, and those get in this weird way intertwined. And the other thing is that oftentimes you blame yourself. So many children grow up saying, "Well, this has to be because of me," and which of course is not true whatsoever, but it's very common. And then, as a result, the baggage you carry from growing up impacts every aspect of your life, every decision you make, every partner you choose, and oftentimes you recreate the events in some way or the circumstances that were very traumatic, because these patterns of behavior or what you've seen or experienced get deeply embedded into your subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And then as a result, you're repeating these behaviors because you have a false definition of what normal is. As a result, of course, it leads to disaster, drug and alcohol abuse, mental illness, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always the opportunity to change your life, no matter what you've done in your life, because oftentimes you have to forgive yourself because it was never your fault. And so many people carry this thing that it's all because of me. I did something and I deserve this. So I think one of the things you have to recognize is that it's not your fault, and that you were, if you will, dealt a deck of cards or dealt a hand that was not fair in the first place.
Yeah.
And so one is understanding that and not carrying that burden that somehow you're at fault. But the other is to recognize that so many of us give away what I would say is our self-agency. And what I mean by that is that one is we end up looking for external affirmation that we believe will make us okay. And the problem, of course, is you can never become okay from external affirmation. You're the only person who can accept yourself, forgive yourself, and understand that we're all frail, fragile human beings. And nonetheless, we deserve to be loved. And I think this is a challenge. So in relationship to manifestation, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
you have to understand and become self-aware of what you've already been manifesting to that point. I'm sure you've seen situations where somebody will say, "Gosh, I don't understand this. I'm going through my third divorce here, and it's as if I married the same partner all 3 times," right? Well, that's because of this unconscious baggage, which is the driver of your behavior. So one of the things you have to stop and reflect on how you got to this point. What were the things that were very negative? And this may require therapy to go back and understand, and then again, accept the fact that it's not your fault. And once you're able to do that, you can start moving forward. But I think that's a key aspect of this in many ways.
Yeah. I wanted to tie in your story because you obviously there was a lot of manifestation from your childhood on, thanks to Ruth, to get to the point where you realized all the things you wanted. Through your manifestation process, you acquired material goods, and then we know that story from Into the Magic Shop that like you said earlier, it didn't bring you fulfillment, right? And so you kind of lost everything, all those material possessions, and then you sort of refound yourself again through more of a spiritual path of manifestation. Did I say that right?
That's exactly correct, in the sense that because of the background which I was just discussing, I manifested what I thought would lead to happiness. And as you can imagine, although I wasn't aware at the time, this was due to insecurity, and it was fear-based in the sense that I was desperate for affirmation from others, and because of my own shame and insecurity. And so I believed that if I got all of these things, I would be okay. And of course, in modern Western culture, success, power, position, money are equated with happiness. And so I climbed these various and sundry mountains, and I did get external affirmation, but none of it filled the emptiness that I felt from my own shame and insecurity. And no matter how much I got, it was never enough. And of course, as I realized today, and which is sad because this narrative continues to be promoted, is that what had happened is my sympathetic nervous system was chronically activated all the time because of my own insecurity and fear. Of course, you have imposter syndrome. So I was acting in that manner. And of course, on some level, this also equates what we would call hedonic happiness, which is the acquisition of things, believing that if you get as much pleasure and avoid pain, you're also going to be happy. And so, at one time I had a large mansion overlooking Newport Bay. I had a penthouse in San Francisco. I had a villa in Florence. I had a Porsche, Ferrari, BMW, Mercedes, Range Rover in my garage. And, all my buddies would tell me how great I am, yet I was more unhappy than I had ever been in my life.
So what was the spiritual path? I mean, and we're not talking the religious sense here, but you obviously had to choose another path. You mentioned it was more of a spiritual path. What does that look like now?
Well, let me just go and explain how I ended up there.
Yeah.
So here I had become very successful. I had become a neurosurgeon. I had become a successful entrepreneur. I during the dot-com crisis, had invested in some companies, was worth about $80 million. I was living the life. I had divorced a few years before. I was living primarily in this penthouse in San Francisco. I was a professor at Stanford. I was running a medical device company. And suddenly the dot-com crash happened. And in about 6 weeks, I was effectively bankrupt. I was about $3 million in the hole because, of course, everything collapsed. And even though I had had some opportunities to get out, I did not. And so I had borrowed about $15 million from the bank to finance my lifestyle, believing, of course, that I had plenty of money. And when that happened, of course, my banker became my best friend because he wanted his money. And as a result, the other person who became my best friend was my lawyer, because I had set up these various irrevocable trusts, and I had set up some trusts for tax avoidance by giving stock to charity. And so this got my attention, and I went through this period of reflection, and it really was what went wrong here, because I did everything I was supposed to do. But what I realized was that I was focused on acquiring things or doing things that gave the appearance that I was perfectly okay and I was worthy and I was prominent. And, I was a neurosurgeon, but it was more about, it wasn't, I was always a very good doctor and kind, but it was more about, I'm a neurosurgeon. Uh, so after this period of reflection, I realized that it shouldn't be about me. And that as I obviously got more knowledge and began looking into this area, I realized that my actions were fear-based because of what I felt my deficiencies were, and I was masking them by showing off to other people. And once I reoriented myself after this period of reflection, I realized it's not about me. And that if what really makes a life or gives a life a meaning and purpose is to be of service to others. And to not always look through the frame of I want, but how can I help? And what happens is when you look through that lens, it's not that you don't get what you want, but that is not necessarily focused, because you understand when you care, when you're compassionate, when you're kind, then there's an immense amount of reward because people do want to help you. And it changes what you want, because this is one of the problems is often what we believe we want isn't what we need. And this is what I finally understood. So the turning point actually was, here I am, $3 million in the hole. I've had to sell everything. And I was talking to my attorney, and he actually informed me that the charitable trust I had set up, actually, they had never filed the paperwork. And he said, if you want, you can keep all of that stock. And after this period of reflection, I decided to go ahead and still give it away. And when that company went public, that was $30 million. And I set up health clinics around the world, blood banks. I set up programs for the disabled, programs for adolescents affected by AIDS, HIV. I endowed various chairs and supported research projects at multiple universities. And fundamentally, it changed my life. And what I tell people is I went from rags to riches in terms of financially, and then I went back to rags, but that was only metaphorically, because at the end of the day, I was a neurosurgeon making more than 99.9% of people, so I certainly couldn't complain about that. But I became rich again, not financially so much, but in terms of the insights and relationships I developed. Because one of the things I did was I started this center at Stanford where we study the neuroscience of compassion, empathy, and altruism. I developed programs through that center that have helped literally hundreds of thousands of people in terms of being kind to themselves, self-compassion, compassion for others. And most importantly, the Dalai Lama became the founding benefactor of that center, which led to he and I developing a close relationship, which then led me to become chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation, which then led me to meet the leading spiritual and religious leaders throughout the world, including Desmond Tutu, Thich Nhat Hanh, Amma, the Hugging Saint, Sadhguru, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Eckhart Tolle, Byron Katie, and a host of others. And that really changed how I saw the world as well. It reinforced what I had already learned. And in some ways, it reflects back on our evolution as a species, because when we are species that, unlike others, our offspring, the litter is small, and our offspring have to be cared for a decade and a half or so. And that requires an immense amount of time and resources. And we have a genetic imperative to care, because if we don't, our offspring will not survive and our species will become extinct. And so when you care, when you love, when you're of service, you're rewarded by the release of various neurotransmitters, one of which of course, which is oxytocin, or the love or bonding or affiliation hormone. And when that is released, that actually, one, stimulates your pleasure and reward centers. Two, it actually causes your brain or cognitive brain networks to function at their best. Three, it affects your peripheral physiology. And four, ultimately, it lengthens your telomeres, where you live longer. So there are all these positive aspects of being in the parasympathetic mode, which is the rest and digest system, versus being in the stress or fear mode, which is the sympathetic nervous system, which are both part of the vagus nerve, which arises in your brainstem, but is distributed throughout the major organs in your body. The greatest distribution is in your heart, actually.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is great because you've jumped into the neuroscience, and we can talk about things like synchronicity and more practical elements of manifestation. I'm really curious about it because your book has lots of steps. Is that a good transition, you think, for us to talk about maybe, okay, if people are listening going, oh, you guys are talking about manifestation like it's, a woo-woo thing, like you said, right? A woo-woo kind of like,
right.
Is this pseudoscience? But you're saying, no, this is actual neuroscience that's proven. And that if we apply it, we can actually see our lives change, or our environment changes when we shift how we view the world, I think is a good way to say it. So could we talk a little bit about what the process is of manifestation? Because you went through it.
Well, and I'm still going through it. Absolutely. And I think as an analogy, because manifestation has been around for thousands of years. I mean, you can look back to the 1st and 2nd century, and there was the Hermetics and this creation of this law of attraction, that if you put out some positive energy, the universe will look down on you and respond to your energy. And then this went through the New Thought movement with Quimby, and then into Think and Grow Rich and Napoleon Hill, and ultimately into The Secret. And in some ways, it's like religion, because from an experiential point of view, as a species over thousands of years, as an example, we learned that compassion is critically important to our survival. And this is caring for others who are suffering. And the thing is that what had happened over time was that this understanding, this idea of the golden rule, got incorporated into almost every religion, because without knowledge, they created a dogma associated with their culture that then, unfortunately, was ultimately used by those in power to control people. But initially, it was to explain why we cared and why we acted the way we did. And Karen Armstrong, who founded the Charter for Compassion, of course, she won the TED Prize and actually interviewed 19 spiritual and religious leaders. She was a former nun, and this was the fundamental basis of every religion: compassion and the golden rule. So in some ways, manifestation is the same way. From an experiential point of view, people learned some of these techniques, and then it got wrapped around woo-woo and pseudoscience.
Yeah. Yeah. And so here we are again. Now we have a kind of a proven framework, if you will, on how to apply these practices where we can pursue the goals that we want and pursue it passionately and achieve those goals. I mean, you're a living example, and now I'm wondering in my own life whether I was practicing manifestation without even knowing it.
Well, and that's the case. I mean, on some level, you can argue that we're always practicing manifestation, but the difference is that it's not understanding that if you want to be an elite athlete, you have to start at the beginning and over time learn habits of behavior that then result in you learning techniques or skills that allow you to become the elite athlete. Most of us are not exposed to those types of skills except by accident, or they occur and we have even no knowledge or self-awareness. And this is what we were talking about a bit earlier, where you can sit there and say, what are you already manifesting? And understanding that all the decisions you've made in your life are because of habits that have been deeply embedded for good and bad and result in essentially every decision you make.
So what are you already manifesting? Okay, so as an executive coach, I can't tell you how many times I find in my conversations with clients how fear plays a role in blocking the path of where they want to go, right? And fear is manifested in, several ways. It could be, you mentioned earlier, imposter syndrome. I'm not good enough. I'm believing this inner voice, and in that inner voice becomes your belief system, the script that plays out over and over, and you stay in that, in that state of fear, or and I think, tell me if this is sort of a trapping that keeps you from manifesting, is the false belief system.
Well, no, absolutely. And again, as you know, the first sentence of my book says the universe doesn't give a fuck about you. And what's meant by that is that so many people, one, give their self-agency away to the opinion of others. And I'm sure you've been in a position either with loved ones, relatives, or others who you say, I'm going to do this, or I want to do that. And they'll say, no, you can't do that. No, no, you're not going to. And you sit there and you believe them. Yeah. And the problem is that when you tell yourself, I'm not good enough, it is not possible, I cannot, that immediately becomes truth. And so on several levels, we create our limited belief system about what is possible for us. The other aspect is when you're hypercritical, then you, and I'm sure you've experienced where you give somebody a compliment, they go, no. And the problem is when you don't believe you deserve, then that limits you in achieving. And in fact, it leads to self-sabotage, especially if you carry this negative baggage of lack of worthiness. So that's part of the problem. What people don't understand, and what neuroscience has irrefutably proven, is actually the power of your belief or the power of your mind to change your life. And whether that's to change your own physiology or to change events that are occurring in your life by embedding your intention into your subconscious, which activates various cognitive brain networks, which then result on a subconscious level of you always being attuned to events that may allow you to manifest.
Dr. Doty, you talk so much about the idea of visualization. It's almost in every chapter of your book as a way to kind of maybe spark up, kickstart your manifestation process. Tell us what the benefit of that. How does it work? How do we visualize what we want to see?
Well,
the process.
Sure, there are a couple aspects, and again, the traditional techniques of manifestation involve visualization, but they involve a few other things. But before I mention that, let me just also share that through our sensory organs, we get about 10 million bits of information a second. On a conscious level, we're only able to process 50 to 100. And so we have limited input, but we have to focus that, right? And so there's a technique that's called value tagging. And essentially, if you have an intention or a goal, you need to value tag it so that your subconscious understands it's important. And the process by which this happens is it results in activation of one part of your brain, in your brainstem, the reticular activating system. But then that also activates what we call your default mode network. And this is self-referential. It is associated with daydreaming or mind wandering. And I'm sure you appreciate that's where a lot of your dreams and aspirations and beliefs come from. And from that, you create a narrative of how you see yourself or what you want. And there's a statement that what fires together wires together. And what that means is, and we were talking about how to become an elite athlete, it requires repetition over and over to create something you might call for an athlete a muscle memory, which automatically gets kicked in. And you're doing the same thing here by manifesting this intention, because once the default mode defines what your intention is, then something called your task positive network is activated. And this includes three parts. It includes your salience network, your attention network, and your executive control network. And what happens is that once you've defined something as important or salient, then this activates your salience network. And the salience network then decides what needs your focused attention. And once you focus your attention, then that activates ultimately your executive control network to then have that on a conscious level manifest. And I'll give you a couple metaphors and then some examples. So I use the metaphor in the book that this value tagging process is basically you creating a file of something that's important and you put it into your subconscious filing cabinet.
Mm.
Within your subconscious, there is a bloodhound that gets the scent and then starts focusing its attention on that scent because it's been defined as important because it's in the file cabinet. And then during waking moments, that bloodhound is always looking for possibilities that may relate to manifesting that intention. As an example, I'm sure you've been to a party that's quite noisy, yet above the din of that noise, if somebody says your name, you turn to it because your identity is very deeply embedded in your subconscious. So you're attuned to that all the time. Another example, and I use it from being a neurosurgeon, is I may tell a patient who comes to me and is very anxious that they have a particular diagnosis. And they'll sit there and they'll go, I have never heard of that before. Is that common? And of course, in my business, there typically is common, but I may see them 6 or 8 weeks later and they'll come back and go, it's the most amazing thing. I've run into 6 people who have the exact same diagnosis. How is that even possible? I didn't realize it was so common. Because again, out of the fear narrative, that's been embedded in them. And now they're always attuned for that diagnosis, meeting somebody, hearing somebody talk about that. And so that's really how it works. And the way it works, again, we talked about the sensory organs. It requires the intention, but more importantly, it requires repetition. How do you make it strong, that embedding? And you do it through your sensory organs. And what I mean by that is, one, you identify an intention. You see yourself in that position. And you repeat that image over and over in your mind. So you're seeing it. Next, you write it down. The very act of using your muscles, if you will, to write it down over and over again. Reading it silently. Reading it aloud. Getting into this position where you feel comfortable being that. And what happens is over time, well, initially that image may be blurry, if you will, in your mind. Over time, it starts getting clearer and clearer. And I don't want to say that there's a 100% guarantee that if you use these techniques, you're going to get exactly what you want. It doesn't work that way. What the statement is using these techniques in the right mental framework, it greatly increases the likelihood of something manifesting, if it's going to manifest at all, versus being in the fear mode, which one may limit your ability to manifest because it affects your cognitive brain networks in a negative way, as well as your peripheral physiology. But also you may manifest something that you don't really want. And of course, as I was describing my own situation, I did manifest everything I wanted, but what I wanted wasn't what I need. It did not make me happy.
That makes so much sense. And so when I'm thinking about when you're in that right frame of mind, you called it relaxed, calm, caring. When you're in that state, that's when your brain releases those happy hormones, right? Serotonin, oxytocin.
Dopamine, yeah. And the thing is, it's interesting because If you look at the work of Dan Buettner and the Blue Zones, he encapsulates in some ways through this discussion how we lived a few hundred years ago, which was typically in small villages, usually less than 150 people often. We were born there, we died there. But the thing is, the community supported us. It wanted us to succeed. And you also lived in intergenerational families who also supported you. And they knew everything about you. They knew the good, the bad, because you live in such close proximity. You've grown up there. Everybody knows about you. And in many ways, that forms you, but it forms you in the context of being loved and cared for. And this, unfortunately, is not how we live in modern society. And as a result, there are several negative things that have occurred. One, the sympathetic nervous system, this flight, fight, or fear mode, was something that's been with us through millions of years of evolution, but it was never meant to be chronically activated. It was meant to deal with the rare situation where a predator presented itself or some other danger. You activated it, you responded to it, you lived or you died, and then you went basically back down to your baseline, which was engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system. And that's where all of us should live. And that's where our physiology, both brain and peripheral, function at their best. But in modern society, there's chronic activation for many people of their sympathetic nervous system. And of course, this is because we're not near people who care about us. We're not living in intergenerational families. As a result, we are terrified of being judged. And we also carry the baggage that we have to provide food, shelter, etc., for our families, which in modern society can be very, very difficult and challenging. And because of this aspect of not having people who support you around, it further activates the sympathetic nervous system. And that's why we have this epidemic of stress, anxiety, and depression and loneliness that is permeating our society. And if you look at how globalization has occurred, we have kindly transferred the worst parts of how human beings can function throughout the rest of the world, which is negatively affecting the rest of the world.
Mm. Okay, we can't make or have a conversation without talking about the heart. And I've written about your work and the HeartMath Institute, their research on the heart. So we got a lot of smart people listening, but you may even have to dumb it down just a tad. I want to talk about, you say that the largest electromagnetic field in the human body is found within the heart. First off, what is that electromagnetic field and what's its significance?
Well, and hopefully, I'm not sure if dumbing down's the right word, but I'll try to explain it so it makes some logical sense. So every living system in our body actually oscillates or vibrates. It's like every atom has an electron and neutron, and it vibrates and spins, etc. So this idea of vibration is universal. And as a human species, we actually, on an unconscious level, again, are highly attuned to these types of vibrations. And in fact, the great thing about your brain is you can train it, and you can even train it to be in different modes of vibration or oscillation. As you know, and we don't have time to go into today, but you have gamma waves, which is when you're synchronized in terms of your thinking, theta, delta, etc. But these are contained by your skull, so they don't extend out beyond that very much. But the heart is different. And the autonomic nervous system, as we discussed, which controls the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, is distributed throughout your body organs, especially in the heart, and it's a two-way street. And what's interesting about that is that the electromagnetic energy emanates about 3 to 5 feet outside of your body, and people are attuned to that. And in some ways, as an example, I'm sure with your partner can walk in and they don't have to say a word, and you can already sense their emotional state. And the same as with other people oftentimes. And it's because you're attuned to this energy that they emanate. And this is why you can see people, and it is not just limited to the energy of the heart, but also a whole variety of aspects of human presence, if you will, that you can tell if somebody's kind or not kind simply by being around them very briefly. And so we are attuned to respond because, in fact, that's also a mechanism how we assess threat. So this is really quite important. And you mentioned the Heart Math Institute. So there is something that is called heart rate variability. Now, a lot of people, when I use that term, think, oh, well, he's just talking about heart rate. And no, that's not what I'm talking about. Because the difference is that two people can have an identical heart rate, let's say 60 beats per minute. Well, one person, their interbeat timing is almost exactly 1 second. So they have low heart rate variability, while another may vary between 0.8 to 1.2 seconds, as an example, and they have increased heart rate variability. Now, the interesting thing about that, and it may even seem paradoxical, is that when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your heart rate variability decreases. And in fact, a low heart rate variability is associated with sudden cardiac death, while an increase in heart rate variability implies activation of your parasympathetic nervous system, this rest and digest system where we all want to be. And actually, that's associated with the opposite. You live longer with that. And so the effects of emotional state on your heart, how your heart responds, which sends signals to the brain, has a profound effect. And even we now are learning that even your gut microbiome, which is also contained by the vagus nerve or surrounded by, also sends signals back to the brain. So we don't appreciate how it's not just the brain sending out signals. There's a lot of information coming from your peripheral physiology. But I think one of the key points of all of this is that with brain training, you can have a marked impact on all sorts of aspects of how not only your physiology functions, but how you walk in the world. And there are even cases where there are monks, or I'm sure you know Wim Hof, the fellow who runs up Mount Everest with his shorts and is barefoot. They can control how they respond to temperature or control their body temperature or their heart rate or even other types of physiologic activities.
Dr. Doty, we are probably in the most divided era in our nation's history. I mean, stress, burnout, hate, fear, division, it's at an all-time high. I mean, just, you know, case in point, last night's presidential debate, if you even could sit through it. So I want you to challenge us, especially leaders, to be more intentional about manifesting the world they want to see. What do we need to do?
Well, first of all, one should never look at the world through the lens of it's us against them. What we should look at is how can I improve the world for all of us? And this is the problem, unfortunately, with the nature of tribes. Again, thousands of years ago, people lived in these smaller groups. It was critical in a hostile environment to work together with a perception of we need to survive. There are these other people, perhaps, or predators who are against us. And you can certainly understand that. But unfortunately, with globalization and the interconnectedness of all of us, that's really not possible. Or if we don't understand that, that will lead to our demise. Because all of us, if you actually talk to almost anyone and you get rid of the narratives that they have been told or that they have bought into, because, if something's repeated over and over again, you start to believe it. And then if you're around people who believe it, then you create a tribe of people who believe it. And there's this echo chamber that goes on, which further reinforces it. But if on an individual level, you talk to almost anyone, we all want the exact same thing. What is that? We want to be happy. We want our children to be cared for. We want security. We want to have food. We want to be able to do activities that nurture us. And but when you start putting in, well, these other people will try to stop me from doing that, or my belief is so important that I need to force it down other people's throat. And that's part of the problem here, is that there's people who somehow believe that if I give complete freedom to these people, they're going to do things that are against my belief system. Well, it's fine for you to have your own belief system, and you can live in that as long as you don't hurt other people or try to restrain other people. Because, as an example, I'm sure you just saw this thing from this school board member in Oklahoma who has sat there and said, we need to teach the Bible and the Ten Commandments in schools, in every classroom. Well, again, how insulting to everybody. As you probably know, and just in terms of Christianity, there are 35,000 sects of Christianity who fight among themselves. There's been nothing that has indicated that there's one supreme form of even Christianity, much less religion in general. And as I said earlier, these religious belief systems are entwined with the history and culture of a particular area. As you know, if a child grows up in a fundamentalist Christian background, there's probably about a 99% chance that they'll be a fundamentalist Christian. It's not because there's some mandate that everybody becomes a fundamentalist Christian. It's the environment in which they grow up in. And frankly, the only truth that exists is, one, the present moment, and the fact that we're all interconnected, and the reality that if we respect other people and understand the world from their perspective without the brainwashing that is so commonly done for power and position, then we will all get along.
Yeah, that's so important. So I'm going to call my listeners to break out of the narratives that are dividing you, whether you're on the left or right, liberal, conservative. I see it clearly that there are underlying narratives there that keep us divided, and it plays on our confirmation bias, because if we do that, then we start to just believe one voice and everyone else is wrong and we are right. So I'm glad that you brought that out in the open, because I think that will keep us from manifesting the world, a kinder, more just world where both sides are looking for the same thing, right? We're looking for we're basically humans looking for the same things.
Well, and this idea of common humanity, which is critically important. What we want is no different than what anyone else wants in most cases. The other actually fascinating thing is, I don't know if you ever saw it, there was a Heineken commercial.
Yes.
And they brought people together, right, of different political perspectives, and they put them the task of doing some project. And at the end of it, they're laughing, they're joking, they're friendly, and you're suddenly going, well, there is no difference between us, right? And now, obviously, they were selling Heineken beer. But the point is that is truth. Once you break down all this artificial divisiveness, we are all the same. We want the same. And most people are loving, kind people, except they get distracted or they get into this echo chamber, which then it becomes very important to them when actually it should have no import whatsoever.
What's fascinating about that Heineken commercial, and I'll put a link to that in my show notes, folks, for you to view it, is that people came in with their preconceived ideas, and basically they came in with walls around them. And really their metaphorical boxing gloves on, ready to wage war, because they opposed people like Dr. Doty says, they opposed somebody. It was, a person that was a heterosexual white male with, I forget now, it's maybe an LGBTQ person, right? Female, and
or a person of different color.
Right.
Yeah.
And by the end, as they became more curious about the other person and started asking more questions, they came to the middle and, like you said, realized their common humanity. That's a thing of beauty.
Yeah, no, I mean, this may sound strange, but it's the only beer commercial that's almost brought me to tears. So no, and again, those types of narratives are very powerful. The sad part is that social media, they don't benefit from promoting connection. They benefit from promoting divisiveness. And this is part of also the problem. And this is unfortunately the part of capitalist narratives, which is it's not about doing the right thing. It's what can I do to maximally increase my revenues, regardless of whether it negatively impacts our society as a whole. As you know, there's some news channels that 80% of what they say is complete disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating and nobody stops them. Now, obviously, there have been some lawsuits where they paid off big about some of this stuff. But again, the amount of money they can make, regardless of that payout, is still massive. And This is why, of course, unfortunately, you don't see necessarily stories about good in the world. You see stories about tragedy, disaster, war, because as a species, we are tuned to negative events because they put us at risk, we believe. And that's why we always turn towards these negative things. Yet, I submit to you that 95% of people are wonderful, kind people, and all this other stuff is made up narrative for which there's an underlying purpose, which relates to money and power.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Wow, that could be a whole podcast in itself. We could talk for hours about that. So as we wind down here, sticking to the theme of your book and manifestation, is there anything that we didn't cover that you think, oh, Marcel, this absolutely we must talk about? Well, if so, what would that be?
Damn it, Marcel, you should have covered this. No, well, there are a couple things. One is manifesting is wonderful. And as outlined in my book, which actually has a 6-step program to assist you, one of the things people need to realize, though, is the thing that causes people to suffer, though, oftentimes is attachment and craving. And how does that relate to manifestation? Well, once you are absolutely fixated on achieving a goal, when you don't achieve the goal, one is you become very hard on yourself. So you become, again, you demonstrate a lack of self-compassion. And what one needs to realize is none of us in our lives achieve every goal. And I actually was just hearing Roger Federer giving a commencement speech about you do the best you can. And if you don't make it, you're done with that and you just move forward. You don't fixate on that. But the other side of it, which is also, I think, very important, is that a goal, what is a goal worth to you? What I mean by that is if you destroy every relationship you have, you get a divorce, you estrange from your children, as an example, because you want to become the CEO of the company and run the company and make the most money, what is it you've achieved? Because you're standing on a mountain by yourself, holding an award, but at what cost? And I think people have to understand that, because for so many people, that goal to be at the top of the mountain is driven by fear and insecurity. And the other aspect is, from a business perspective, when you are driven by fear and anxiety, while that may result, when you act that way towards others as well, for them to, let's say, increase productivity, it's not sustainable and people are unhappy. And so indirectly, you're causing yourself more problems. And what I mean by that is, one, you decrease the productivity and creativity of your employees. Two, it has a negative effect on individuals' health. So it dramatically increases healthcare costs. Three, you don't appreciate that people then avoid promotions or they're constantly looking for another job, which dramatically increases human resources cost. There's a great example by a guy whose last name was Carnes, and he was from, I think, the Australia area, but he ended up leading through fear, because this is how he believed, based on his own fear narrative and him always striving to be the leader of the company, which he did, that this was the way to function. And so, as you're well aware, the corporations do these 360 evaluations, right? So he hired a company to come in to do that. And now I may screw up some of the facts here, but fundamentally the generalities are the same. So this happened. So the people who ran this came to him and they said, we have to tell you, you have the lowest morale of any company we've done this on. Your employees don't like you. And you are in terms of the various metrics, you are the worst leader of any company we've ever done this with. Now, somebody who has the mindset that I was just describing, his first response was, I'm going to fire those people. They're idiots. They don't know what they're doing, right? Well, what happened was he went home and he told his wife, he said, can you believe it? I hired these people and they said this and this and this about me. What do you think of that? Because I'm going to fire them. And she looked at me and said, well, they're absolutely correct. And she said, what? And she said, I have been telling you this for the last 20 years and you've never listened. So at this point, he actually took this to heart and he went on a 2-year self-inquiry, which ultimately led him, in this case, to Buddhism. And he then incorporated these practices into his organization. And shockingly, productivity went up, creativity went up, shareholder price went up, expenses in terms of human resource and medical costs went down. And this is the power of kindness, compassion, thoughtfulness, self-care, et cetera. And of course, these types of studies have been repeated in multiple organizations at this point. You cannot sustain a fear narrative. The thing that pulls all of us together is a vision of our common humanity and love.
Thanks for that. I want to give a shout out to CCARE, the organization that you founded at Stanford University. So CCARE, folks, is the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, CCARE. So I get your emails, and a lot of other research that you put out really helps to inform my own work. So just share a little bit about what you're doing over at CCARE.
Sure. And then I'll share another project, which is independent of CCARE, but very much related. So in addition to the fundamental research we've done, which of course ends up in scientific journals, but we have actually created a number of training programs to teach compassion and self-compassion, because this is critically important, and to have the ability to emotionally regulate and see the world through the lens that we've been talking about. And so we have programs for students. We have programs for the average person. We have actually programs for first responders. We actually also do consulting for corporate entities. And in fact, we recently signed a contract with a company called Emanates. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a corporate education program.
Have not.
We interact with business schools like MIT, Stanford, Harvard to bring many of the courses to the corporate environment. But through my own efforts to educate them on the power of compassion, we've actually created training programs for them actually to distribute we've created. And we also have an applied compassion program or an ambassadors program. And the great thing about this is that it's for individuals from the corporate environment, for the healthcare environment, or for the mind-body well-being space. And this is a program that lasts, initially it was for 11 months. We were cutting it down to about 6 or 7 at this point. But we actually mentor the participants in developing a program that they can then teach others at their home organization. And we have people from over 60 countries involved in that. So that's quite powerful. And again, it's a multiplier, right? Because once you train somebody, they train others, they implement these programs, and we've had impacts on well over 1 million or more people just from those activities.
Wow.
The other thing that I have been doing, which is independent of C-Care, is I started a company based on some of the things we've been talking about, which is the epidemic of stress, anxiety, and depression. And the challenge is that even if there were enough therapists, which there aren't, many people could not afford to go to a therapist. But many of the problems in terms of stress, anxiety, or depression are primarily situational and come up just because of the environment they're living in. And we know that if you have an empathic listener, that can dissipate almost all of these feelings.
Wow.
And the interesting thing is what I've been working on is I've created an app, and I know, and you're probably aware there are almost 40,000 mental health apps. But what I've done is a little bit different. And this is the imperial I, means Jim Doty may say, I did it, but there are a lot of people who are involved in that. But anyway, we created an emotion assessment engine that monitors your emotional state through voice analysis, through facial expression, through context of speech, which is connected to a conversational AI knowledge base of compassion-focused therapy and psychology, which is then connected to a human-like avatar. And the fascinating thing is I'm sure you've tried virtual reality classes. Well, typically one of the things they do to sort of show you how powerful this is they put you over an abyss on a bridge or a plank. And then they sit there and they say, jump off the plank. And almost no one is able to jump off the plank, even though on a cognitive level, you know it's not real. Well, the same is true when you interact with a lifelike avatar. You get an emotional attachment to it, which is far different than sort of typing in something into a chatbot. And that actually also affects how you respond, because when you're talking to what you perceive as another human being on an unconscious level, in a narrative that is supportive, that's empathic, that's compassionate, that dissipates your feelings of stress and anxiety. And this isn't meant in any way to replace human interaction. It's what it's meant is to give you tools to get back to your baseline to continue with like interaction. And the great thing is, unlike, let's say, online therapy even, is that it's available 24/7. And, you know, for most of us, when does our anxiety and stress occur? It occurs in the evening when we're not distracted by what the requirements of living in the real world. So it's readily available. You can chat with it. The other interesting aspect is that the state of California did a survey among adolescents in terms of mental health apps. And one of the things they said, and it's actually been demonstrated now through science, is that many of these individuals would rather talk to an avatar than a human.
Wow.
And the reason is because you're not being judged.
Yeah.
And there's this, again, terrifying fear that you're going to be judged. And what's interesting too is, while it's predominant in adolescents, it's also true in the general population more and more, because this is why people can't be authentic at work even, because they're terrified that if they say something that somebody's going to judge them again. And it's also true in certain areas of the world, like in Asia, India, the Middle East, where there's taboo about talking about your mental health. So, we've done some work which has demonstrated the power of this. Now, nothing starts out perfect, but we've created a pretty significant advance in this. We haven't officially launched, but if anybody wants to use it, you can go to happy, and that's with an I, HAPPI.ai. So the Y now makes happy with AI in it, right? So happy.ai. So we're going to launch that in a couple months. And if anybody's interested in getting involved in any way, reach out to me, give the app a try, give me your thoughts. So that's the other thing that I'm doing. And I've also started the next book.
Oh, you have? Oh, man. You want to give us a sneak peek?
Sure. It's called Gut Instinct, the Neuroscience of Intuition and Why It Matters.
I can see that as the perfect segue to a mind magic. As
Yes,
sort of like the next level.
And then I've already outlined in my head the next one, which is the neuroscience of love.
I'll be all over that one.
Yeah, so I have to say I'm quite honored, and you may not know this, is that when the book was first published, and put out there, it was put on Amazon initially as one of course, a place where to sell books, but it was running about in the 400,000. When it was launched on May 7th, it went all the way up to the top 100. And it was, for a period of time, at the same time, number one in neuroscience, meditation, new thought, which I have no idea what the hell that means, spirituality, and let's see, and biology. So, I'm blessed that it's been so well received, and I'm appreciative. But I think it's also a statement of what people are yearning for, which is a clear-cut understanding of, one, how the brain works. And of course, everyone is interested in, how do I manifest the life that I want?
Yeah.
And this gives actionable tools that allow people to do so. And it's not woo-woo, it's not pseudoscience, it's based on an understanding of how the brain works. And people should never forget how it is in their hands, once they understand how the brain works, to use this incredible tool that we have to not only affect their own lives and their own physiology, but to really positively affect the lives of other people around them.
That's why I challenge the skeptics, if there are any skeptics listening, to grab this book, because if you're challenged by this whole woo-woo pseudoscience movement, I think Dr. Doty's book pushes against that, to prove otherwise, that this stuff is actually real solid science with evidence. And I think you're living proof as well. Having learned of your upbringing and your horrific childhood and the stages of your life that you had to go through. And like you said at the beginning of the show, you're still manifesting. I think we all are still manifesting.
No, that's right. And what's interesting is that people say to me, well, are there things you haven't manifested? Of course there are. There are many things. But in terms of, and again, it gets back to Roger Federer, life is not 100% wins. And sometimes things don't manifest for good reason. But in the big scale of things, if I just simply look back on my own life, I have had many, many more wins than losses. And there are things that manifestation doesn't work on my or your timeline, right? And, there are things that I've wanted to manifest. As an example, I've been promoting two things, or many things, but two of them are the creation of a World Compassion Festival, where we bring spiritual and religious leaders together, celebrities, musicians, to do a sort of a one world type of thing, or we are the world type of thing. But it's not a one-day event, but underneath it is a platform that promotes charities, nonprofits, NGOs who are doing good in the world, where people can connect with them, interact with them, donate to them, and become part of, which is a living entity that I believe has the ability to change the world. So, I have this idea, which I talk about in the book, which is dispositional optimism. Recognizing things, I don't control the timeline of things, but I have a firm belief in these possibilities. And in some ways, this is what this book promotes, is a belief in unlimited possibilities that each of us have to change our own lives and the lives of other people.
All right. We bring it home finally with two questions, as we do with every guest. The first one is the love question, kind of sticking to the theme of the show. So speak to the CEO, the high-level leader up in the C-suite, who wants to adapt a more human-centered leadership approach to affect company culture. How would they lead and teach others to lead with more love, actionable, practical love?
Well, of course, you have to love yourself to give love to others. And I think that's very, very important. So many people are in fear, and we talked about the imposter syndrome, that some people are going to find out that they're really not the leader they're supposed to be or should be. But it's a little bit different as well in that there's this fear of being your authentic self. And when that fear is the driver, uh, it blinds you.
Mm.
And the thing is, as an example, I often get in the front of people and give talks, and some of these stories, even now, years and years later, are really affect me. And my voice may crack, or I may even shed a tear. And the thing is, it's okay. You're a human being. Plus, none of us are infallible. And if you accept yourself, and frankly, we don't have to go into Jungian philosophy, but accept your shadow self. I've never had anybody come up to me and go, "You're such a jerk for crying or saying these moving statements and showing emotion." Actually, what people want to do when you are that way, and I can't tell you the number of talks where I've given and somebody say, "Can I give you a hug?" And suddenly there are 100 or 200 people giving me hugs. And I feel like Amma, the hugging saint, right? Because people desperately want authenticity. They want to see you're a human being. They want to see that you are also frail and make mistakes. And you're okay with admitting to it and being that person. That's what people want. They don't want somebody who is separated from them, who thinks they're particularly important. And I think that's one of the very, very critical aspects. And the other is nobody wants to be treated like a widget, like they're just immediately replaceable.
Mm.
I walk through the hospital, and I always say I can tell a good physician. And this is a person who knows the nurses' names, honors the people who are sweeping the floors or changing the bedpans, because even as a neurosurgeon, I cannot do my job without those people. And I honor them and respect them. It's not that they're beneath me. They are part of a team of which we come together to save people's lives. And in an organization, you are there to enhance the lives of the people who work with you so that together you can create a company that is doing things to improve the world. Now, you could sit there and argue, well, we make some obscure part for something that goes somewhere that nobody will ever see and has no huge impact. But then if that's the case, that's okay. But if you give people a purpose in terms of what they're doing, as an example, you create a situation where people can have a certain number of days off if they're involved in a charitable activity. As a company, you come together and say, let's pick 3 causes that we're going to work on together here. Because all of these things bring people together for a common purpose. And when people care for other people, support other people, that makes them have meaning and purpose, which is the critical thing that leads to sustained happiness and depth of happiness, and actually makes people more healthy.
I love it. It's again, going back to the theme of common humanity. We're all striving for the same things. It's bringing us together and really to discover what those things are. Love it. All right. You close us out your way. Closing remark or a key takeaway. Bring us home.
Well, what I would say for all of our listeners is every one of us has the ability to improve the life of at least one person every day. Every one of us. And that can be through a smile. It can be through a hug. It could be through buying a meal for somebody. It could be doing some sort of charitable act. Every one of us has that ability. And I will assure you, every time you do that, it will not only make you feel better, it'll not only improve your physiology, but it will also change the lives of those around you. And nothing is more gratifying on a heart level than to be of service and to improve the life of another person.
Wow. The book again is called Mind Magic, the Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. If you're watching on YouTube, there it is. Dr. Doty, if people want to connect with you, where can they go?
You can send me an email at jrdoty, Doty, at stanford.edu. You can also reach me at happy.ai, HAPPI.ai, at jim@happy.ai. You can go to my website, which is my personal website, which is jamesrdotymd.com, and it has books and talks and all this stuff there. And you can certainly check out CCARE at Stanford, which is CCARE, CCARE, at stanford.edu. And I really appreciate all of you listening. I thank you. I thank you for the support that many of you have given me who may already have interacted with me. And again, also, thank you, because I'm sure the reason you're here is to help you improve your own life. So thanks again.
Dr. Doty, you are an exceptional human being and such a model for how we can really attain the best version of ourselves. And I'm so grateful that you came on the show today. So thank you.
Thank you.
You can keep the conversation going on social media with hashtag Love in Action Podcast, and also look at my show notes as well as a YouTube link to watch the show on my website, marcelschwantes.com. I'll be sure to have all of Dr. Doty's contact info there as well. And finally, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode of the Love in Action podcast, hey, let's chat. Just reach me out on my website or find me on LinkedIn.
Thank you for listening to the Love in Action podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it, subscribe, and leave us a review. Until next time, don't forget, the future of leadership is love in action. Believe it, practice it, and watch your leadership and business flourish.